First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. It's been a while since I've been to Seattle, and it's nice to be back, and it's nice to see such a beautiful day, even though we're kind of inside and not enjoying the beautiful day. And it's funny because, and thank you for the invitation, Mary Grace, I appreciate that very much. And it's funny when the conference was introduced as an international conference, because recently I did a DNA test, right? And I discovered that I am partly Irish, partly Scottish, partly West Indian, and partly Norwegian. So, you can tell that I was a Norwegian person. And so we are truly international.
Thanks to you.
Anyway, what I want to do is just to bring some thoughts around dementia in relation specifically to theology. Because I think theology's got something to offer to the conversation. There's a very interesting English philosopher called Elizabeth Anscombe who talks about the importance of how we describe things and the language that we use to describe things. Because the way that you describe something determines what you think you see, and what you think you see determines how you respond to what you see. So the language you use around dementia, the way that we describe it is really, really important. But there's lots of different ways in which we can describe the same thing. And so each entity in the world, all of our experiences, can be described from different perspectives, from the perspective of medicine, or the perspective of neurology, or the perspective of psychology, or the perspective of just being a friend with somebody. And all of these descriptions determine how we respond. So I think what we're trying to do this afternoon is to take three ways of describing dementia. One that comes from a social work orientation, one that comes from neurology, and one that comes from theology, and try to see if we listen to all these different descriptions, what comes out at the end, and how much wiser we may be. None of these descriptions are better than the other description, but they do all tell you something different about what it means to live well with dementia. So I'd like to begin with a story. A friend of mine who is a chaplain who works alongside people living with dementia told me this story the other day. And she said she went into a ward where a number of people with advanced dementia were living. And she went and sat down beside one woman. Her name was Beatrice. And she sat down beside Beatrice and she said, "Beatrice, would you like to pray?" And Beatrice didn't say anything, because Beatrice on the whole didn't say very much in life, but Beatrice was always seemed to be aware, is the way that she put it. And so the chaplain began the Lord's Prayer. And as soon as she began the Lord's Prayer, Beatrice put her hands together and began to pray. And she prayed, and she prayed, and she prayed. The chaplain couldn't quite work out what it was she was saying, but what she was saying, she meant it. It was intentional, it was important to her. And she says, the chaplain said to me, I had to stop her in the end, and I don't know what to do with that, because I couldn't understand what she was doing, but at the same time, there's clearly something wonderful going on in the midst of that. And that made me think that there's something very important about Beatrice and Beatrice's story, because how often do we think of someone with advanced dementia as a prayer warrior? As somebody who really does pray. I mean, Scripture tells us that when you pray, God listens. So presumably, when Beatrice prays, even though we may not be able to understand what that which means, something happens. So there's something profoundly important at a spiritual level that goes on in that. But it's really easy to lose that because of the cultural stigma that is attached to dementia. So Stephen Post, who's a very interesting ethicist who has written some fantastic stuff on dementia, he talks about the danger of Western culture being hypercognitive. Now by that he means that we place an inordinate emphasis on intellect and reason and using our minds in particular ways. And you can see it in our day-to-day conversations, that you meet somebody, one of the first things you'll say is, "What do you do?" And then consciously or unconsciously you put them on a hierarchy of here down to here. The chances are that the ones that you respect as a Westerner are the ones that people use their minds. It's just kind of ingrained into the way that we think and see the world. And so that makes it really, really difficult to have something like dementia. It makes it very difficult to have something like a mental health challenge as well, where your thinking is different from the way that culture assumes it should be. But that hypercognition means that the automatic reaction to somebody like Beatrice might be just to say, well, it's just neurology, or well, she just had her dementia. But if you scratch a little bit more fully, maybe we can see things differently. If we describe it slightly differently, her situation, something interesting happens. Take the response that she has when, as soon as the Lord's Prayer begins, she enters into the posture of prayer. Because one of the things that we forget or overlook is that our bodies remember things. And it's quite interesting because when we think about memory loss in relation to dementia, very often we think of primarily in terms of recall. That we're no longer able to recall things that we did in the past and bring them into the present and plan for the future. That's one mode of memory. But actually the whole of our bodies remember things. And over time, as we engage with the world, our bodies remember what's going on. And you can see that really clearly if you've ever been in a context of worship with people with advanced dementia, where you put on the music or you say a prayer and suddenly people engage in ways that they simply don't engage in at other points in time. There's something very beautiful about that. That's because people's bodies remember. And the key thing about bodily memory is it's not just reflex, it's intentional. It's always about something. Over time, these guys have practiced their faith. And now in this time when they are no longer able to cognate in the way that they used to do, their body continues to do. But it's still about something. It's still about God. It's still about Jesus. It's still about worship. So when people raise their hands in worship, then it's about something. And when you begin to re-describe that experience, you begin to see there's something very powerful and very meaningful about that kind of encounter. And I came across this little passage that the Apostle Paul wrote. And he says this, he says, the only letter of recommendation we need is you yourselves. Your lives are a letter written in our hearts. Everyone can read it and recognize our good work among you. Clearly you are a letter from Christ, showing the results of our ministry among you. This letter is written not with pen and ink, but with the Spirit of the living God. It's carved not on tablets of stone, but on human hearts. We're confident of all this because of our great trust in God through Christ. It's really a very beautiful image that when you look at somebody whose body remembers in that sense, you're looking at a letter that's been written by God over time. Now, the church I go to, we never do the same thing twice. Like every week we have different music, every week we have different liturgy. And over time, it's a very dementia-unfriendly church, because I'm sure a good dementia-friendly church should be boring and repetitive, have the same structures and rituals, the same hymns over time, so that when you come to that space in your life where you can no longer cognate in that way, actually you've learned something and you're able to express your spirituality in different ways. So Beatrice reminds us of that dimension. But also, the other dimension that's worthwhile thinking about is the way in which spiritual practices can open up neurology. I was reading a really interesting book by Oliver Sacks. It's a book, he's a neurologist who writes of unusual neurological conditions. And he's got a book called, I think it's called Musical Philia. And in the last chapter, he talks about dementia or Alzheimer's. And one of the things that he says in there is that the brain is, he says, is plastic and quite clever because it realigns itself when it's damaged. So he says some of the parts of the brain that are very involved with memory are quite close to the parts of the brain that process music. And so if you have damage in your brain, very often music can open up pathways to enable you to access memories and thoughts and ideas that you couldn't do at any other point. And so when you hear music, you actually are able to access memories that are just not available. And when you hear, when these memories become available, you have fresh experiences of who you are. It takes you back to places, to experiences, to relationships, to a sense of identity that really is inaccessible, but very, very important. But it only lasts as long as the music plays. So as soon as the music stops playing, and we get a little bit of residual memory, they eventually goes. And so that music, he says, becomes the key. And the key there for those of us who want to be with people with advanced dementia is to be in the moment, to shift our understandings of the nature of time and begin to recognize that these moments are profoundly important and people are taken to a space in life where they simply can't be at other points in time. Now, in order to do that, we need to think slightly differently about personhood and slightly differently about time. This is a picture of Jean Vanier, who died sadly this week. Jean Vanier is the person who formed the large communities where people with intellectual disabilities and people who don't have intellectual disabilities live together. Not as carer and cared for, but as friends together, in what he describes as the way of the heart. So Vanier says it's a mistake to think that the intellect is the way in which the most important aspect of who we are as human beings. He says it's the heart. He says the heart is the deepest, most fundamental aspect of the human being that's touched and transformed by the Spirit. And he says the heart is that place that lies within all of us at every moment in time, where it's a sense of connectedness. Connectedness with one another, connectedness with other people, connectedness with God. So the heart is that place of connection. What we need to do in relation to those of us who have come to that stage in our lives where we can no longer use our intellect and reason in the way we used to, is to find ways of encountering and discovering the heart. And in order to encounter the heart, we need to slow down and take time for those things that the world considers to be unimportant. So, Kusaka Kiyama, who's a Japanese theologian, many years ago wrote a little essay in a book called The 3 Mile an Hour God. And this is how it goes with him. He says, the average speed that human beings walk at is 3 miles per hour. Jesus walked at 3 miles per hour. So Jesus, who is God, walks at 3 miles per hour. Jesus, who is God, who is love, walks at 3 miles per hour. Love has its speed, he says. Love has its speed. It's a spiritual speed. It's a different kind of speed from the technological speed to which we're accustomed. It goes on in the depth of our life, whether we notice it or not, at 3 miles an hour. It's the speed we walk, and therefore the speed the love of God walks. There's something very, very beautiful about that, because most of us live most of our time watching the clock. Right, so I was sitting in a hotel room this morning at 3 o'clock in the morning because I couldn't sleep. Because I'm still in UK time. You guys have got such strange time. No offense, but. And I was thinking, like, I've got a clock on my iPad, I've got a clock on my phone, I've got a clock on my wrist, I've got a clock on the television, I've got a clock on beside me here, and I'm surrounded by clocks. Like, and that suddenly struck me that obviously, most of our lives we're driven by the clock. It's very rare for us to actually sit down and stay in the moment and to think about, well, maybe this is useful, maybe this is a nice part of the way to be in the world. So time is oppressive, it drives us, it pushes us away. St. Augustine, a very important church theologian, talks about time in his autobiography. And he says, I know exactly what time is, unless you ask me to describe it. In this case, I have no idea what it is. And it's a bit like that. But he wants to work out, and I'm just coming to the end of what I want to say, but what Augustine wants to do is to work out what time is. And his big dilemma was this. how can God, who be unchanging, and still be in touch with time? Because time's always changing. And the way that he solves that complicated question is this. He says, when God creates the world, he brings time into existence. So time's a creature. Time's something that God creates. And when the world goes wrong, when the world falls, when the world ends up in the kind of state that we find ourselves in, time falls with it. And so the kind of time that we live in is no longer, it's not surprising, it's oppressive, because it's fallen, it's broken, it's damaged. And he says, what we need to do is to redeem time and put it to its proper purposes. And it seems to me that there's an ideal opportunity as we engage with one another, those of us who live with dementia, those of us who don't live with dementia, to redeem time. To spend time to be with people in the moment, to be with one another, not only actually people with dementia, all of us together, to learn how to be in the moment, to learn to walk with the 3 mile an hour God. I have a friend who works in a busy American hospital, and I was talking to him about the 3 mile an hour God, and he said, well, this place makes me walk at 9 miles an hour. And I said to him, well, who are you following? So Jesus is walking at 3 miles an hour, you're walking at 9 miles an hour. That's not going to end well. Yeah. But it's something important. So when we slow down and take time for those things that the world considers to be trivial, people like Beatrice come straight to the fore. Suddenly we realize that her prayers are meaningful. Suddenly we realize that despite the fact that we've been rushing around doing things for her all this time, suddenly she's in that space of spirituality where we're surprised. And you can only be surprised if you slow down and take time to be with one another. And so, finally, Joseph Pieper is a scholar of Thomas Aquinas, and he's got a fantastic book called Faith, Hope and Love. And right at the end of the book, he begins to give a definition of what love is. And he says, love is to say to the other, it's good that you exist, and I'm glad that you're here. And I like that. In fact, why don't you turn to the person beside you and say to them, it's good that you exist, and I'm glad that you're here. Or it's good that you're here. So if you could stop looking at that for a second. So, two things before I sit down. Point number one, nobody said it to me, so I'm fully
It's good that you're here.
It didn't even cross your mind, did it? Anyway, putting that to one side in my heart. A moment. There's truly one loving man in the room. But secondly, and not positively, that's the exact opposite of the way that many people within society think about dementia. That it's like the opposite of love. And I think one of the tasks that those of us who notice that is to reintroduce the way of the heart and to help people to know and help ourselves to understand what it means to look at the other person and say, it's good that you're here, I'm glad that you exist. Because I think love is the beginning point for transformation. Thank you.